I wish it were the case that I could feel comfortable, sending my kids out anywhere and everywhere, not worrying about it. But I do have to think about Tamir Rice. I do have to think about the fact that my son, who's 8 years old, looks like a 12-year-old, and depending on the context, might be mistaken for someone older than his age, and how unfortunately it is still the case that little black boys are often perceived as being a threat. That's the reality that we live in.
Unapologetic from Premier Unbelievable.
Well, Adam, before we talk specifically about Martin Luther King Jr., would you just share a little bit about some of the things you do, I guess, from an apologetics perspective, particularly the work that you're doing through True ID?
Awesome. Yeah. So I'm Adam Coleman. I'm the founder of True ID Apologetics Ministries. True ID stands for The Real You, Imago Dei, obviously Imago Dei being Latin for image of God. And so a lot of my work revolves around that, just really addressing identity issues and how our identity is grounded in Christ and what that actually means, how we live it out. Just in the course of initially getting into apologetics, I encountered a number of questions and objections to Christianity that were circulating, particularly in the African American context. And I just wanted to be a resource to address those questions and objections. So I've got material for all folks, and that's just one area of specialty that I delve into.
Thanks so much for that, Adam. Well, I certainly am very grateful for the work that you are doing.
Thank you.
Now, on Monday, the 28th of August, that marks 60 years since the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his now incredibly iconic I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Adam, your grandfather was at the March on Washington back in 1963. Would you share just a little bit of his story with us?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I just brought this with me. Popped over next door to his house, and I don't know if you can see this, but I actually brought a recording. This is a record that was published. It was live recorded that day. And then I think he purchased it soon after. I tried to get a date as to when they actually published it, but this is actually from my grandfather's house.
Oh, wow. Genuine vintage.
Genuine article right there, So my granddad liked to talk, for sure, just in general. And one of the things that he loved to talk about was his experience that day. He was at the March on Washington. As a matter of fact, it was common for Dr. King to try to contact religious leaders and lay leaders in churches wherever there was going to be some sort of demonstration to collaborate with them to pull off an event or something like that. And my grandfather actually received a letter from Dr. King along those lines because he was the head of the usher board at the time. And so they enlisted him to be part of that organizing, group. And so he was just very proud of that. He was always excited about it. And he used to talk about, just that day, how, everybody was of one mind and of one focus, to get that many people in one place without there being any sort of, shenanigans and so forth. It's hard to do. It's very hard to do. But, he just talked about how they were well prepared, before getting out there. There was a lot of talk about, not bringing, violence with you in your heart, and not, doing anything that would disrupt or I guess I should say undermine the integrity of what was going on that day, And so he would always say, when we got there, we marched down the road and as soon as it was over, everybody went straight out. Nobody stayed around in Washington. Like we got out of there immediately, but we didn't want to do anything to disrespect, Dr. King and what would happen that day. And he was just so proud of it, just being there in that moment, listening to the speeches and just seeing not only African Americans, but people of various different ethnicities of goodwill there together to essentially not only just for like an event, but just really celebrating freedom, celebrating the freedom that they believed was to come. So it was just very dear to him. And for myself, growing up here, I mean, goodness knows, that goes back to as far as I can remember hearing that story over and over again. And it just really made Black history, if you will, just, close. It wasn't something that was way off in the distance back in the day, but it was right there in front of me. And so I just really, I always carried that with me in my heart.
And I mean, you've definitely touched on this a little bit, and I'm sure your grandfather's impact had a really profound impact on you. But how has Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech impacted you personally?
Yeah. Well, the I Have a Dream speech really is like an echo it's like a kind of a culminating echo of all the freedom fighting voices of the African American tradition. And so when you hear Dr. King talk about that check, that has come back insufficient funds, and then they've come to cash that check. I mean, that's Frederick Douglass. You can hear Frederick Douglass in that, with his what's coming now to be known as the what's in the enslaved person as the 4th of July. You can hear Harriet Tubman in there. You can hear even in terms of the homiletic tradition. Just the repetition of phrases. I mean, you just hear all of that in this one speech. And so, for myself, I feel like it's always been a call back to the best of what the African American tradition has had to offer. I remember when I was in college, from the outset. I mean, I actually, my undergrad was in criminal justice, and I ended up doing a master's in social work. I always wanted to impact the community. I always wanted to be that person who, in my generation, did something to move that call forward. And echoing in the background of my own efforts, has always been that I Have a Dream speech. I think that it's just something that's powerful. I listen to it, like every other month, just as kind of a reminder of what it is that this tradition has to offer.
Now, do you think life is dramatically different in regards to segregation and racism than it was 60 years ago when Martin Luther King Jr. delivered this speech? Or do you think in some ways we've not gone anywhere near as far as he would have perhaps hoped that we would have done? So
that's a good question. And in some ways, I think it's a complicated question. On the surface, of course, there are some things that have changed. It's irregular for, groups of Black people to be assaulted by police officers and water hoses. I mean, that's not a regularity, if you will. There are laws that are no longer on the books that were obviously discriminatory. So certainly there have been some changes in that regard. But in many ways, I do think that the civil rights movement, as expressed, by the I Have a Dream speech, is in some way it's been misinterpreted. It's been misinterpreted in the sense that it wasn't necessarily a reparative movement as much as it was an access movement. Essentially it was, these rights that should be afforded to all people, whether it be voting or otherwise or what have you. These rights, we've been restricted from access. And so, the country needs to grant us access to the things that we ought to have already. But it didn't necessarily repair the bruises that had been exacted upon, minorities. So that's a whole different piece. I mean, there are economic bruises, there are social bruises, there are all types of bruises. So, for example, when you think about the practice of redlining, which I believe was on the books, from 1935 to maybe 1964 or something like that, 30 years of discriminatory practices from banking institutions doesn't go away, just because you grant access to people to vote. Obviously there are economic implications of that unfortunately I think still reverberate even to today, and so I think that while it is the case that, of course, the civil rights movement was certainly a turning point, and I think there's been a great deal of change, positive change. I mean, for goodness sake, we've had a president in the White House, so obviously, there's been some progression. Nevertheless, I think that there's still a ways to go, and I think that for that reason, I think 2020, 2021 took a lot of people by surprise. When you saw so much unrest in regard to, racial tensions. But I think if you understand that the civil rights movement was an access movement, that's not necessarily a reparative movement, meaning addressing those economic and other bruises that had been exacted by the system, the government, then it makes a lot of sense why we would see a resurgence of that tension, because there are still things that need to be healed.
And I mean, this is an absolutely massive question, and I totally understand if you can't answer it. But
okay.
What do we do then to heal some of those tension? What is the way forward? I guess building on the legacy of people like Dr. King, how do we move forward to repair some of that damage? Do you think, Adam?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think one of the things that I do love about America is that it has always been a place where the voice of the dissent has a place in the discussion. You can go back to Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. I mean, it's that voice of contention that holds value, here in the States. And I think that we just have to continue to do that. We have to continue to honor that tradition and realize that no nation is perfect. I mean, that's just the nature of human beings. Human beings are imperfect, and they create imperfect systems and structures. And so with that in mind, it's no shame of a nation to be diligent, to look for ways to continue to improve. And I think that's what we need to be about the business of doing. I think sometimes people again, misinterpret, the nature of a critique. I think that, whether it be Frederick Douglass, I can name several others. But it's actually in the critique that the love for America is often expressed. It's in the desire to see America to be its best self, that people bring concerns to bear. And so I think that we have to be discerning. I think that we have to be diligent and disciplined, in looking for areas where there can be improvement, and then, hop into the occasion when need be.
Adam, there's a line in Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech that I think always sort of gets me slightly choked up. I mean, the whole speech does, but there's a beautiful line. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. Yeah. I mean, do you think this dream has been realised 60 years later? Or do you think we're still in that tragic situation where people are being judged by the colour of their skin rather than their character?
That's a hard question. It's a hard question. I'm the father of 5 little children, and so that's something that I think about quite often. I wish it were the case that I could feel comfortable, sending my kids out anywhere and everywhere, not worrying about it. But I do have to think about Tamir Rice. I do have to think about the fact that my son, who's 8 years old, looks like a 12-year-old, and depending on the context, might be mistaken for someone older than his age. And how unfortunately it is still the case that little Black boys are often perceived as being a threat. That's the reality that we live in. And the studies show this out, but just about anybody that you encounter, particularly in African American context, either them or someone that they know, someone that they're related to, has experienced some sort of misconduct at the hands of the police. I may not, obviously it's not always something, fatal, typically it's something to a lesser degree, but that is a reality. And so whether it be in that context or in others, I am mindful to, let my children know that even though we love everybody, and that's what Jesus teaches, nevertheless, we do have to be careful still, because everybody doesn't abide by that. And so, particularly myself, I live in Virginia, I live in the South, and I actually, my day job, if you will, is to be a community organizer, where my job literally every day, all day, is to work with clergy in terms of building bridges so that we can have the kind of communities that Dr. King's described. And every day, that I go to some of the localities that I work in, I have to drive by the Confederate battle flag. I'm riding on Jefferson Davis Highway, who was the president of the Confederacy, and, things of that nature. So it says to me that while there have been tremendous legal changes, certainly in America, there's still some heart changes, that need to occur. And this is something that Dr. King acknowledged as well. Like, he acknowledged that you can't change people's hearts necessarily with the law, but you can keep people from killing me, by putting certain things in place. And so I think that's the dichotomy that we wrestle with. Certainly progress. I certainly wouldn't want to undermine that. I believe that it's a dignity to the greatest of our tradition to acknowledge the progress that we've made. But I also think that we have to be mindful that there's still ways to go.
Thank you so much for that, Adam. I mean, you don't have to look in great detail at Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech to see that it's completely saturated with the Bible. I guess one of the things, as we're talking about these really important issues, one of the questions that keeps coming up in my mind is, why was his belief in equality so embedded in a Christian worldview? And I guess, what does that mean for us today when a lot of the West in particular seems to have sort of rejected Christianity, which is obviously the basis upon which Dr. King was basing so much of his necessity for this equality? Because, as you've already said so beautifully, we are all equal and loved in the eyes of God.
Absolutely. Oh man, I mean, we could spend hours talking about that, because I mean, this "I Have a Dream" speech really does come on the tail end of a wave of freedom fighters, many of whom, I should say, tapped into the biblical worldview to ground their fight for abolition or fight against Jim Crow and so forth. And so Dr. King is greatly informed by that tradition. I mean, I can think about people like Ida B. Wells, for example, who was another freedom fighter who considered herself to be a missionary. She wasn't just exposing lynchings in the South, but she considered herself to be a missionary for the kingdom of Christ. We can talk about Fannie Lou Hamer, We can talk about Martin Delaney, J.W. Le Guin. I mentioned Frederick Douglass. We can talk about Absalom Jones, Richard Allen. I mean, there's just so many names throughout, and those who predate, Dr. King, who held on to the biblical worldview and then utilized that in their fight for freedom. We would just run out of time, trying to address them all. I will say this though, that it is unfortunate that many people have lost track of the necessity for maintaining the biblical worldview as people fight for freedom. I've written articles on this before, but the reality is that particularly on something like atheism or other worldviews, you just don't have that moral grounding, in order to even have the vantage point, to argue, for something like what Dr. King would be arguing for. And so I think we really pull the rug from under the best of what a justice movement can be when we leave God to the side, and that's something that you see, going back to the earliest points of the freedom tradition amongst African Americans. One thing that comes to mind, if I could really quickly, is that there's a gentleman by the name of Josiah Henson, quite some time ago. He was the real life person that Harriet Beecher Stowe based the character Uncle Tom on, with Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Josiah Henson was an abolitionist. He'd escaped to freedom at some point, did quite a bit of tours in Europe and so forth, obviously advocating for abolitionism. And, one later in his life, he decided he wanted to bring his wife back to the plantation that he'd come from, so he writes in his autobiography that they go back and the plantation is overrun with brush and so on and so forth. And by this point, his former slave master had passed away, but the wife was still there. So he goes in to see her. Long story short, she's very sickly, can barely see, doesn't recognize him. And so the only way she's able to recognize him is that he had scars on his arms from when he had saved the slave master's life, decades before. And so in feeling those scars, she recognized that it was Josiah Wedgwood. She says, "Oh, sigh, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your master is dead and gone." And then he responds to her, says, "No, madam, my master is yet alive." And he's referring to Jesus Christ, And so it was this notion of anchoring oneself in something higher than one's condition, particularly the God of Christianity, that for so many enslaved persons propelled them forward to freedom and to strike out for the freedom for others. And it's really what you see, again, culminating in the I Have a Dream speech, that voice penetrating and being spoken to American society more broadly.
Adam, thank you so much. If I could just spare one more minute of your time, I guess
Sure.
What I'd love to know is, how do we, as 21st century citizens living in a country that, not just a country, we're in different countries, in a place that is it's different and not where Martin Luther King Jr. would have wanted it to be, but we've gone a little bit of the way. How do we best honor Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech in the way that we live going forward, do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that when you look at the I Have a Dream speech, he talks about how this is just the beginning. It's not the end, but it's just the beginning. And particularly when you think about some of his writings where he's talking about, say, the Vietnam War and nuclear power, and he gets into economics and just the importance of civilized nations engaging poverty. Dr. King ultimately had in view the Imago Dei. He even mentions that in several of his speeches. We need to honor the Imago Dei, and it plays itself out in various different contexts. Whether it be specifically in regard to race, or whether it be in regard to how we leverage power, for and against one another, economics and so forth. As I mentioned, I think that the best way to honor Dr. King's legacy and to honor what he conveyed through the I Have a Dream speeches in your context. Who can you see? Who can you look out and see where that Imago Dei is not being respected, where it's being undermined in some sort of a way? It doesn't necessarily have to be a racial slur or something like that. Of course, that would count, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. It can be in any way where somebody's just the image of God in that person, that basic foundation of dignity is being undermined. And obviously, Jesus, harkens to this as well. So many times he talks about the least of these, how God cares about the least of these. We ought to care about the least of these. We ought to care about people who are just on the rough side of wherever society happens to be, the brokenness of this world happens to be. And I think that if we're doing that, if we're being intentional about caring for the least of these, caring for those who have not been treated in a way that's commensurate to the Imago Dei, then that's the best of what Dr. King would want us to live out.
Adam, thank you so much. How do we find out more about what you're doing with True ID Apologetics?
Okay, great. Yeah, definitely come on over to my website. I've been a little bit lazy with it, as of late, so I'm trying to get some new articles up. But True ID is TRUID apologetics.com. You can also visit me at my YouTube page, which is TRUID Apologetics. YouTube/TRUID Apologetics, as well as on Facebook. I'm there listed as The Real Adam Coleman, Instagram, The Real Adam Coleman, and Twitter, The Real Adam. Yep.
Adam, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
Unapologetic from Premier Unbelievable. For more shows, resources, and our newsletter, visit premierunbelievable.com.